23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, listening to his radar operator call out a contact moving through absolute darkness north of the Philippines. 26 years old, 43 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills already to his name. What happened over the next 80 minutes would make him the highest-scoring night fighter ace in American history. For 2 straight weeks, Japanese bombers had hit Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days, because American engineers were racing to finish 2 airfields that would support the entire Lingayen Gulf invasion. Stop those airfields, and you stop the invasion cold. 20,000 American troops slept in tents below Smith's squadron that night, and the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, only 3 days into their deployment at McGuire, was the only thing standing between those tents and 12 inbound Japanese bombers. The Black Widow was unlike anything the Japanese had faced. 66 feet of wingspan, twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, 4 20mm cannons in the belly, and buried in the nose, the real weapon, SCR-720 radar, capable of finding an aircraft 5 miles out in total darkness. Japanese bomber crews flew at night, believing the dark made them invisible. They had no tail warning radar, no way to know a hunter was already behind them. That assumption was about to get several of them killed. Lieutenant Philip Porter sat behind Smith in his own compartment, watching a radar scope divided into 2 readouts, azimuth left or right, elevation above or below, guiding Smith toward contacts with verbal corrections precise enough to close a kill in complete blackness. The math of the night was brutal regardless of skill. 12 bombers inbound, roughly 3 hours of fuel, maybe 10 minutes per engagement. At that rate, Smith could reach 3 bombers before he had to turn for home. 9 would get through untouched. If you want to see how Carroll Smith hunted down bombers in total darkness that night, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. 4 separate contacts on the scope, all inbound, all at different altitudes. Smith pushed the throttles forward and climbed at 2,000 feet a minute into a sky with no moon, no stars, and heavy cloud cover blotting out every visual reference he might have used. This was exactly the kind of night the Japanese had picked on purpose. It didn't matter. Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. Porter vectored him onto the first contact. Heading, altitude, range. Corrected again and again, until Smith's own smaller scope picked up the blip himself. A Mitsubishi G4M, the type Americans called Betty. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single good burst away from becoming a fireball. Smith closed through 1,000 yards on radar alone, seeing nothing but cloud until 500 yards out, when a barely visible dark shape resolved against slightly less dark sky, faint orange glows leaking from the engine nacelles. He eased below and behind, centered the bomber in his illuminated gunsight reticle, and at 350 yards, squeezed the trigger. 4 cannons fired together for 2 full seconds. 48 rounds total, tracers cutting red lines through the dark. The Betty's right wing came apart, and the fuel ignited instantly, the burning aircraft lighting up the cloud layer as it rolled into a dive and struck the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. 1 kill, 11 bombers left, and Smith's fuel gauge already down 15%, with 3 more contacts still crawling across Porter's scope. The second bomber sat 23 miles from the first kill site. 5 minutes at cruise, every one of those minutes carrying it closer to the airfield Smith was supposed to be protecting. He pushed the Black Widow to 320 miles an hour, burning fuel at a rate that cost him 3 minutes of patrol time for every minute at that speed. Closed through the dark to another Betty flying straight and level, with no idea it was being hunted, and fired another 2-second burst at 350 yards. Both engines caught fire almost simultaneously. The bomber hit the water at 0019, 17 minutes past midnight, 2 kills down, fuel at 42%, and 2 more contacts waiting. Porter had 2 targets left on the scope, separated by 8 miles and several thousand feet of altitude, 1 high and distant, 1 low and dangerously close to the airfields already. Smith gambled on the higher target first. reasoning the climb cost less fuel than a hard descent, and turned north into a contact that behaved differently the moment Porter locked onto it, turning, climbing, dropping altitude at random. Someone aboard that aircraft already suspected American night fighters were working the area. It was a Nakajima Ki-49, the type called Helen, faster than the Betty, better defended, with a tail gunner covering dead astern. Smith adjusted his whole approach, coming from below and to the left instead, exploiting the poor ventral coverage most Japanese bombers shared. The Helen kept juking through the dark, and Porter compensated by predicting the pattern rather than merely tracking it, guiding Smith down to 600 yards, then closer, until at 375, the tail gunner finally spotted the Black Widow and opened fire, tracers streaming past Smith's canopy. Surprise was gone. Smith had seconds left to take the shot before the Helen went fully evasive, and he fired a longer 3-second burst, 72 rounds, that tore through the fuselage and blew the right engine apart. The bomber rolled inverted, spun, and hit the water at 0029. 3 kills. Fuel at 28%. The point most pilots would already be turning for home. 1 bomber remained on Porter's scope. The low-altitude Betty Smith had bypassed earlier, now only 12 miles from Mindoro, and close enough that Smith could see the airfield searchlights sweeping thin white beams across the sky below. He dove to conserve fuel, leveling off just above the target at 4,200 feet, for a diving attack that would cut the bomber's reaction time to nothing. At 350 yards, he checked his ammunition. 512 rounds left, enough for maybe 3 more engagements if he was careful. And his fuel gauge, reading 23%, below any reasonable safety margin. 1 shot. He fired at 0034, another 2-second burst, and watched the Betty's port wing separate entirely as the ruptured fuel tanks caught fire. It struck the water at 0035. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes, and 8 surviving Japanese aircraft simply turned back, rather than press on into whatever was waiting for them in the dark. Smith turned for McGuire with 21% fuel remaining. The mission technically already a total success. 0 American casualties, construction uninterrupted, the invasion timeline intact. Then at 0042, 12 miles from the field with fuel down to 19%, Porter picked up 1 more contact, inbound, sitting directly between Smith and home. Turning to intercept meant burning fuel he almost certainly couldn't spare. Letting it pass meant risking everything the night had already bought. Smith turned toward it anyway. The contact resolved at 800 yards into something entirely different from the night's earlier targets. A Nakajima Ki-84, the Frank, one of the best fighters Japan still had in the air, faster and more maneuverable than the Black Widow in a straight fight. But the Frank pilot had no radar and no idea Smith was there, flying blind on visual references that simply didn't exist in that darkness. Smith closed to 300 yards with his fuel gauge reading 17%. Knowing a miss meant disengaging immediately, with barely enough fuel to make the runway at all. He fired the longest burst of the night, 3 full seconds, 72 rounds, into the Frank's tail and engine cowling. The fighter caught fire, rolled, and dove. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected, a white parachute canopy blooming against the black sky before the burning wreck hit the water at 0046. Fuel, 15%. McGuire Field sat 11 miles south, and the numbers were unforgiving. Roughly 22 minutes of flight time against a field that had been operational for exactly 4 days, marked only by a single row of kerosene lamps, barely visible from 5 miles out. No instrument landing system, no margin for a bad approach. Smith descended toward those lamps with Porter, reading the coastline off radar, navigating by compass heading alone through cloud and darkness that offered nothing else to steer by. At 0055, 3 miles out and 800 feet up, every one of the 12 runway lamps went dark at once. Complete blackness, where a landing strip was supposed to be. Fuel at 9%, roughly 8 minutes left, nowhere near enough to divert 90 miles to the nearest alternate field. Porter suggested the radar altimeter, accurate to within 50 feet, and Smith committed to descending on instruments alone through total darkness, trusting dead reckoning to put him somewhere near a runway he couldn't see at all. He came down through 400 feet, then 200. Airspeed bled back to 120 knots against a stall speed of 95, a margin thin enough that any error in either direction could kill the crew. Gear down at 0058. 3 green lights confirming the wheels were locked. Full flaps extended. Descent rate climbing past 300 feet a minute, with fuel now reading 7% and falling. At 100 feet, Smith cut power further to force the descent, dropping through 75 feet, 50, 25, seeing nothing but instruments, and the hope that his math had been right the whole way down. The main wheels struck crushed coral at 0059, harder than a normal landing, but the gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith stood on the brakes and rode the Black Widow down through 100 knots, 80, 60, 40, unable to see a single foot of the runway he was decelerating on, until the aircraft finally rolled to a stop with 6% fuel left in the tanks. Perhaps 3 minutes of flight time, on a night that had already asked for everything a man and a machine had to give. Ground crew found him with flashlights and guided the aircraft to parking. Engines off at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. 5 intercepts and 4 confirmed kills packed into 55 minutes of actual combat, followed by a blind instrument landing on a runway with no lights at all. Smith climbed out with his legs stiff and his hands shaking, not from fear, but from having spent everything he had. Porter climbed out of his own compartment, having tracked every single contact flawlessly. Night fighting only worked as a partnership, and this one had just set a record. It didn't end there. The next afternoon, December 30th, Smith and Porter flew again, intercepting a Japanese reconnaissance fighter, another Ki-84 Frank, and downing it in a diving attack that pushed his total to 7 confirmed kills in under 24 hours of flying, the highest single-day total of any American night fighter pilot in the entire war. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron scored 18 kills total across its whole Pacific deployment. Smith's 2 missions alone accounted for well over a third of that number. Smith received the Silver Star for the December 29th mission. He survived the war, came home in February 1946, left the military, and never sought publicity or wrote a memoir. His record living on, mostly in unit histories and dry intelligence reports rather than headlines. The airfield he defended supported the Lingayen Gulf landings exactly on schedule on January 9, 1945. Engineers later estimated that unchecked Japanese bombing that December night would have delayed the airfield by 2 full weeks, and with it, the entire invasion timeline. The P-61 Black Widow never achieved the fame of the Mustang or the Thunderbolt. Heavy, unglamorous, built for a job most people never saw happen. But on one cloudless black night off Mindoro in December 1944, it was the most advanced night fighter in the world. And Carroll Smith was, by any measure that matters, the best pilot who ever flew one. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if anyone in your family served, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence.